Philip Roth wrote a piece back in the early 60s about the impossibility of being a novelist in America. And it only gets more true. The true stories are so incredible. And you're competing with these true stories that are absolutely unbelievable, and you have to write believable stories that feel true to people.
So what got you interested when you started with your first book, Baltimore Blues? What was it that you took as the root of what you were going to write about?
I think a lot of things came together. I was very motivated to want to write a novel. I've been trying for years, and I'd been caught up in that cycle of writing autobiographical, pretty words, no plot, or I hoped they were pretty words. There was definitely no plot, and nothing happened. And there was nowhere to go with them. And I got the idea I'd been reading a lot of mystery novels, and I'd been reading, again, sort of based on place. I remember at the time I was reading Sarah Paretsky and Walter Mosley and Carl Hyacin. And
is this in the late 90s?
Early 90s, actually. Okay. I would date it to like 1991 when I started reading, and then it's actually like 93 or 94 when I start trying to write the book that becomes Baltimore Blues. It occurred to me that a mystery novel, it's either finished or it's not. A lot of people in grad school, they have their unfinished novel and they show you 60 pages and it's beautiful, you should finish it one day. It's impossible to show an unfinished mystery novel to someone. They either want to read the rest of it right away or they don't want to read it at all, in which case you failed. But I said I would have to figure out story. I would have to figure out plot if I did this, and that would be good for me. And I didn't know of any long-running mystery series set in Baltimore. There were some failed attempts at series that have been set in Baltimore, but to this day, I think, Tim Cockey came along after I did, and there were other, but Baltimore, as ever, was late to the trend. Every city in the country, it seemed, had a private eye series based there, but Baltimore didn't, and it was just kind of there and available, and I loved the city.
And you knew it.
I knew it, but it's a problematic love. I don't think the city's perfect by any means, and I'm always sort of working out, why is it I love it here? What is it other than it's home, it feels right?
Baltimore's it's a very interesting city. It's got a blue-collar background, and yet there's all kinds of money and society around it. It's a city that's been hugely in transition, the whole development of the harbor into something else, and I think a lot of immigrant communities there. Baltimore has just a huge amount of backstory.
You would never want for material there. I sort of feel as if, and by the way, there's like more than enough for one writer. There's so many different versions of Baltimore that it's incredibly accommodating to anyone who wants to write about it. I don't feel threatened when someone like Tim Cockey comes along and wants to write about Baltimore because it's so different.
But Tim was really not really writing about Baltimore. He was writing about a funeral home culture and a comedy thing. And Baltimore, I always thought, was sort of incidental to that.
He was writing about the Baltimore that Baltimore wishes it were.
Oh, okay.
I think a more charming version of Charm City, if you will, where all the memories were good memories and the more unpleasant facts of the past weren't stressed.
There's some very nice, I remember Barbara Michaels wrote a couple of her suspense novels with kind of a colonial background there. She lives in Frederick.
Right.
And I've had lunch with her actually in her house a couple of times. It's a, very old farmhouse kind. Well, actually, it's nicer than an old farmhouse, but it's an old house. I've always thought it interesting that she just wrote a couple of those romantic suspense novels, but never really developed her long-running series. Is Egyptology, so of course she couldn't do that there now. But there's so much past in Maryland.
There's a lot of past. For the U.S., of course, when people from Europe come over, they laugh politely at our sense of what is old, but there is a lot. And Baltimore has a particularly complicated history. It's south of the Mason-Dixon line, by definition a southern place, but Southerners never experience Baltimore as Southern. They don't see that at all. Maryland was forced against its will to fight with the Union in the Civil War, which was such an unpopular decision that there were riots, and the first Union soldiers who were killed in the Civil War were killed in the Baltimore riots. Here's a fun little thing that it's great to sort of trip up people, not you because you know history, but people who think they know history, is to point out that the slaves of Maryland were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation because it only freed the slaves in the Confederate States.
That's right.
Right.
And Baltimore, if I remember right, Lord Calvert, it was a Catholic background there because when George IV married Mrs. Fitzherbert and theoretically had a couple of illegitimate children, I don't think this has been documented, but rumor has always had it that they were sent off.
Maryland was founded as a refuge for Catholics in a sense, and it has a big Catholic population. The Baltimore accent, which is extremely distinct, has been traced to, I believe, Cornwall, and is believed to be a variation of the Cornwall accent of Cornish, of the 17th century.
Well, you had a wonderful time, I think, in the Tess Monahan books exploring that. You've also written some standalone novels, and you wrote what, four or five Tess? How many was it before? Maybe it was 6.
7 Tess.
Was it 7?
7 before I did the standalone. Before I did the first standalone.
Why?
Why did I do the first standalone?
No, why was it 7? Because you strike me as somebody who might have done it sooner.
You know, I think I was being kind of perverse because it was right around the time that there was standalone fever. And there'd been these very successful books with, for Dennis Lehane with Mystic River, for Harlan Coben with Tell No One. And I just thought, well, it seemed like everyone was suddenly writing a standalone. And initially I didn't want to be part of the pack. And so I remember at the time I said, well, I think what I'm going to do instead, I decided to model myself instead on Peter Robinson. And, oh gosh, In a Dry Season, I almost forgot the title.
Right.
And I said, I'm going to try to write a bigger, deeper book within my series that struck me as more interesting, less trendy. And I thought Robert Crace had done the same thing with L.A. Requiem. And these are two writers, I mean, I admire all of those writers, but there were a lot of people talking about standalones, and they were just starting with the idea of, I'm going to write a standalone. You know, it seemed a little backwards to me. You know, they just thought, well, I'll write outside my series and then I'll be Dennis Lehane. And I liked the idea of seeing, well, how far can you push the series? What can you do with it? How deep can you make it? How, you know, what can you do with this known universe? So I took on that challenge of writing The Last Place. And I wrote a standalone because I had an idea that absolutely did not fit Tess Monahan's universe, and I couldn't put it aside. I couldn't let go of it. The idea had actually been with me for a while. It first came to me in the fall of 2000. I was in England, and there was some legal maneuvering involving the Jamie Bulger case there were 2 10-year-old boys who killed a toddler. And a judge was asked to remand them to adult prison when they were released from the juvenile facilities in which they had been held. And it was very emotional. You know, it was a horrible murder. It's a horrible, horrible murder. And people were frustrated. They wanted more punishment. They didn't like but the judge said, you know, if you don't think 2 10-year-olds can be rehabilitated, then it's the whole philosophy of the juvenile system is that the very young can be saved, and they deserve it, and we treat them differently, and we withhold their names and give them. And he said, so they will be released, and they will have new names, and as can be done in England, it will be criminal to reveal those names or to reveal who they are and where they are. And I was a journalist at the time, and the first thing I thought was, you couldn't do that in the U.S. You could not protect 2 young juvenile offenders if the press became determined to out them. And a book about 2 girls who kill a baby, that wasn't a Tess Monahan book, because it was about them. It wasn't about what Tess Monahan thought about them,
right,
or about her finding out what really happened. It was about what happened to them, and it just had no place in the series, and I just had to write it.
I don't know if you remember, but I remember that you sent me a copy of it with a letter in which you said, you know, some of that, and said you know, wondered how people would react to it.